Anna Dugan stood at the fence line with her hands wrapped around the top rail, knuckles white, staring out at the wide, empty stretch of cracked earth that spread eastward from the barn all the way to the ridge of cottonwood trees nearly a quarter-mile away. It was September of 1882, and the afternoon sun was punishing and flat, and the field lay bare and brown and utterly without life, as it had every season she had been here, every season she had watched from this exact spot, puzzling over the silence that lived in that particular piece of land. She had not planned to ask him today. She had told herself for weeks that it was not her business, that she was only a hired hand in a manner of speaking, brought to the Kendrick ranch outside Harlan's Creek, Texas, to cook and keep the house and manage the chickens and the kitchen garden, and that the east field was his land and his decision and his silence to keep. But 4 years, her neighbor Mabel Dodd had told her when she first arrived in May. 4 years he has not touched that east field. Not a plow, not a seed, not a drop of irrigation water. And Mabel had looked at her with that particular expression women exchanged when they knew more than they said, and Anna had filed the information away and waited. She heard his boots on the dry ground before she saw him. Arthur Kendrick walked the way men who had carried something heavy for a very long time walked, with his shoulders slightly forward and his jaw set, and his eyes moving always to the middle distance, as though the near world was too sharp to look at directly. He was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate without much thought for pleasure, and there was a quality to his face that Anna had spent 4 months trying to name. It was not hardness exactly. It was more like a door that had been shut from the inside and locked, and the key hung somewhere just out of reach. He stopped beside her at the fence and looked out at the east field the same way she was looking at it, and there was something in that shared gaze that made her chest tighten. "You have never planted it," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact laid gently between them. He said nothing. "For years," she said. "Mabel told me when I came. I thought it might be the soil or the water table or some practical reason I did not understand. But I have watched you work every other piece of this land like you are fighting it personally, like you owe it something. And then you stop exactly at that fence line and you turn around and you never look back." She heard him exhale. Long and slow and controlled, the way a man exhales when he is deciding something that has been waiting a very long time to be decided. "You want to know why," he said. "Only if you want to tell me." The silence stretched between them like the field itself, wide and dry and aching. And then Arthur Kendrick said the thing he had never said aloud, not to his ranch hand Clem, not to the preacher in town, not to the doctor who had come out on a cold morning 4 years ago, and stood in that east field with his bag and his steady professional face. He said it quietly, almost without breath, and the words fell into the afternoon air and became real in a way they had never been before, and Anna felt them land against her skin like something physical, something that changed the shape of the world between them permanently. "My wife died there," he said, "in the east field. I found her there 4 years ago this November. She was 26 years old, and she was gone before I could get the doctor to her, and I have not been able to put anything living into that ground since." Anna did not move. She did not offer the quick condolences that were the social currency of grief, the "I am so sorry" and the "she is at peace now and the God has a plan." She simply stood beside him and let the words be as large as they actually were, and after a moment she placed her hand over his on the fence rail and left it there. That was the moment everything changed between them. But to understand what it meant, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to May, when Anna Dugan stepped off the stage at Harlan's Creek with 2 carpet bags and a borrowed courage, and met the silent, locked-door man who would crack open everything she thought she had built around her own heart. Anna had come from Galveston. That was the polite version. The full version was that she had come from Galveston by way of a broken engagement, a public humiliation, and a father who had spent the family's last savings on a business venture that failed the same week her fiancé. a merchant named Thomas Greer, discovered that marrying Anna Dugan no longer came with any financial advantage, and had quietly removed himself from her life with a letter so cold and efficient it might have been a business dissolution notice. She was 26 years old and she had exactly $37 and a list of skills that amounted to excellent cooking, passable sewing, competent housekeeping, and a reading level that most men in Galveston had found either impressive or unsettling depending on their nature. She had seen the advertisement placed by a ranch outside Harlan's Creek, seeking a capable woman to manage the domestic operation of a working cattle ranch, meals and house, and the small kitchen garden, in exchange for a monthly wage of $12 and room and board. It was not glamorous. It was not what she had imagined for herself at 26. But it was clean and honest, and it would get her out of Galveston, where every street corner held some fresh reminder of the betrayal she was trying to stop rehearsing in her head. She had written a careful letter. Arthur Kendrick had written back in 3 sentences. "The position is available. You may begin May 1st if agreeable. There is a stage from San Antonio that stops in Harlan's Creek on Tuesdays." That was the entirety of their correspondence before she arrived. The stage from San Antonio left a great deal to be desired. It was hot and crowded, and the springs were worn, and every rut in the road announced itself directly through Anna's spine. And by the time she stepped out into Harlan's Creek, she was dusty and slightly disheveled, and full of a fierce determination not to show any of it. Harlan's Creek was a small town of perhaps 300 souls, built along the stage route and the river, with a general store and a livery, and a church, and a saloon, and the particular quality of small western towns in 1882, which was a sense of being both fully alive and perpetually temporary, as though the whole enterprise might pack up and move on in the night. Arthur Kendrick was leaning against a post outside the stage office. She recognized him not by any description he had given because he had given none, but by the way he was watching for someone, and the way he looked like a man who had not been pleased to be put in the position of waiting. He was taller than she expected. The set of his mouth was serious in a way that suggested it defaulted there, not through current mood but through long habit. He picked up her bags before she could manage them herself, which was both practical and slightly disorienting, and he said, "Miss Dugan," and she said, "Mr. Kendrick," and that was the whole of their introduction, as he led her to a wagon that was already loaded with supplies from the general store, a detail that told her he was efficient with his time and did not make 2 trips when one would do. The ride out to the ranch was 6 miles of open Texas hill country, grass and scrub oak and limestone outcroppings going gold in the afternoon light, and Arthur Kendrick drove without offering conversation, which after a few minutes of waiting Anna decided to accept as simply the nature of the situation rather than deliberate rudeness. She looked at the land instead. It was beautiful in the particular hard way of that country, not soft and cultivated like the coastal landscape she had grown up with, but spare and clear and honest, and something about it suited some part of her that had been unsatisfied for a long time. The ranch itself was larger than she had anticipated. 240 acres, she would learn. A main house that had been built solidly, with more rooms than one man needed. The kind of house that had been built for a family, and was now too large for its single occupant in a way that announced itself quietly in every underused room. A barn and 2 corrals, a chicken coop, the kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild and needed attention, and then the fields, several of them, and then the east field, separated by a fence, lying empty. His ranch hand Clem Hardesty lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn. Clem was 52, lean as rawhide, with a sun-darkened face that folded into deep lines when he smiled, which was often. He tipped his hat to Anna when Arthur introduced them and said, "We are very glad to have you, ma'am," with a warmth that immediately told Anna that the domestic operation of the Kendrick Ranch had been struggling for some time, and that Clem, at least, was unambiguously relieved by her arrival. The house was not dirty exactly, but it was the house of a man living purely for function, stripped of every unnecessary comfort. The kitchen was capable but cheerless. The main room had a fireplace and 2 good chairs and a table and nothing else. The bedroom Arthur Kendrick occupied was behind a closed door she never opened. The room she was given was at the other end of the house, small and clean, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and beyond it to the east field. She spent her first 3 days rebuilding the kitchen garden, scrubbing the kitchen to her own standards, organizing the pantry, and cooking the first proper meals the house had seen in who knew how long. Arthur Kendrick ate without comment, which she chose to interpret as satisfaction rather than indifference. On the 4th day he said, "This is the best biscuit I have eaten in 3 years," and the specificity of the time frame struck her, though she did not know yet what to do with it. She learned the shape of his days. He was up before light. He worked the cattle with Clem through the morning, came in for the midday meal, went back out, returned at dusk, ate, and went to bed. It was a life of extraordinary discipline and very little softness. And Anna, who was by nature observant and who had spent enough of her own life hiding things behind competent surfaces to recognize when someone else was doing the same, began to understand that Arthur Kendrick was not simply a quiet man. He was a man in the ongoing act of keeping something at a careful distance from himself, working his land and managing his days with a thoroughness that left no room for whatever it was that lived in the east field. She did not ask, not in May, not in June. She settled into the work and the rhythm of the place and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked it. The physical reality of good, honest work, the satisfaction of a kitchen that ran well and a garden that yielded things, the particular pleasure of the early mornings when the Texas light came in sideways and golden through the kitchen window, and she had the place to herself, and a pot of coffee on the stove, and a kind of peace she had not expected to find here. She liked Clem, who was funny and kind, and told her stories about the early days of the ranch with a loyalty to Arthur Kendrick that was plainly genuine and moved her. She liked the land itself, the way it changed through the day and the week, the dramatic afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the west and broke the heat and left everything smelling of wet limestone and sage. And she was aware, in the careful way she kept most things, that she was noticing Arthur Kendrick in ways that went beyond the professional. The way he moved, the rare occasions when something surprised a smile out of him, brief and real before it was tucked away again. The evenings when he would sit on the porch after supper with a cup of coffee and the day's newspaper from town, if Clem had picked it up, and Anna would sit at the other end of the porch mending or reading, and they would not speak, but there was something in the shared quiet that felt, she thought, more intimate than most conversations she had had with Thomas Greer in 2 years of engagement. But she knew better than to trust that. Thomas Greer had taught her something important about the hidden motives of pleasant men, about the gap between what people showed and what they held in reserve. She was not going to make herself vulnerable to that kind of trap again, not when she had no resources left to rebuild from. In July, something shifted. She had been in the kitchen just past dark, making up preserves from the summer's tomato surplus, when she heard him on the porch, not sitting, pacing. It was unusual enough that she wiped her hands and went to the door and looked out, and he was standing at the porch rail facing east, into the dark, and there was something about the set of him that was different from his ordinary containment, something that was less like a locked door and more like a locked door under pressure. She almost retreated, almost let the darkness and the distance manage itself, but she said instead, "Are you all right?" He turned around slowly. In the lamplight from the window his face was stripped of its usual careful management, and what was underneath was not something she had words for yet, but it was not all right. He said, "Fine," which was the most transparent lie she had heard in months. She did not push. She said, "There is coffee still on if you want it," and went back inside. And after a moment she heard him follow her in, and she poured 2 cups and set one on the table across from where she sat. And he sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup, and they sat in the kitchen that smelled of tomatoes and August and wood smoke. And he did not say anything, but after a few minutes the pressure in him seemed to ease slightly. And Anna thought that sometimes the most important thing you could do for a person was simply not leave. It was July 14th. She remembered that later, when she understood that it had been the anniversary of the day he and his wife had come to the ranch. He had never told her that. He had not needed to. She had simply stayed, and that had been enough for something small to begin. August was different between them than May and June had been, not dramatically. There was no declaration, no obvious turn, but the quality of their shared silences changed. He began to speak more at meals, small things, observations about the cattle or the weather or the news from town, and she responded in kind. And gradually the exchanges grew longer and had more in them, and she found herself saying things she had not said aloud in some time. Things about Galveston and her father's business and books she had read and opinions she held about various matters. And he listened with the kind of attention that was different from politeness, was genuinely, actually listening. The way people listen, when they are interested, rather than when they are waiting for their turn to speak. She told him about Thomas Greer one evening in August, not the whole story, just the shape of it, the engagement and the financial collapse and the letter. She did not make it dramatic. She laid it out plainly as a set of facts that had led her here, to this kitchen, to this porch, to this particular arrangement that suited her. And he listened without interrupting, and when she was finished he said, "That was a cowardly thing he did." And the flatness and certainty of his judgment, delivered with no hedging and no social softening, did something surprising to a knot in her chest that had been there since February. She thought about what she knew of dark pasts and forced choices and the way grief could hollow a person out and leave them functioning but empty. She thought about the East Field. She thought about the 3 years and the biscuit. She thought about the particular way his face looked when he was standing at the fence line looking out at that empty ground. She did not ask. Not yet. She was waiting for the moment when it was right, or perhaps for the courage. Sometimes they were the same thing. In early September, there was a situation with cattle that required Arthur to ride out to the far northern range for 3 days with Clem to deal with a fence breach and some strays that had mixed into a neighbor's herd. He told her before he left that she could manage the house as she saw fit, and that he would be back Thursday, and she said she would be fine. And he paused in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued yet. And then he said, "You have done well here, Miss Dugan," in a tone that made the professional observation sound like something else entirely. She stood very still in the kitchen after he was gone, and had a serious conversation with herself about what she was doing. About the fact that she had come here with $37 and a broken engagement and a dark past of her own, and had built something stable and good, and that the last thing she needed was to develop feelings for her employer that would compromise the only solid thing she had managed to build since February. About hidden motives and the traps of pleasant men and the particular vulnerability of women who had already been burned once and should know better. She was thorough and honest with herself. She named the thing clearly there in the kitchen. She said, out loud, to the empty room, "I have feelings for Arthur Kendrick that have no appropriate place here." And then she went out and watered the kitchen garden and fed the chickens and got on with things, because that was what you did when you were Anna Dugan. He was back Thursday, as promised, and Friday was ordinary and Saturday was ordinary. And Sunday, after the midday meal, they both ended up on the porch in the particular way that seemed to happen more and more often, and he said, out of no particular nowhere, "Did you have people in Galveston, people you miss?" She thought about it. "My father," she said. "He is not well, but we write." And a friend named Clara who married a man in Houston and moved away 2 years ago, not many others. "Did you miss the city itself?" "Not as much as I expected to." He nodded, looking out at the yard and the cottonwoods beyond it, and then he said, I grew up in Waco. I sometimes miss the river there, the Brazos. He paused. I came here in '77, bought this land and built the house in the spring, married in the summer. He stopped. Anna held very still. I have not spoken much about that time, he said, to anyone. And then he seemed to reach a limit and the door came down again, gently but firmly, and he said, the evening is pleasant. And she let him have the retreat and she said, it is. And they sat in the cooling air and the last light came through the cottonwood leaves in long gold slants, and Anna thought soon. It would come soon. It came on a Tuesday in late September, the way the most significant things often come, not in the moment you have prepared for, but in a spontaneous, unguarded instant when the conditions are simply right, and you are both standing at the fence looking at the same empty ground. Arthur Kendrick said, my wife died there, in the East Field. I found her there 4 years ago this November. She was 26 years old and she was gone before I could get the doctor to her, and I have not been able to put anything living into that ground since. Anna's hand was still over his on the fence rail. She could feel the tension in him, the way the body holds what the voice has just released, bracing against the aftermath of saying a true thing for the first time. What was her name? Anna asked. He looked at her. Not with surprise exactly, but with the expression of a man who had expected either condolence or silence, and had been offered instead the thing that actually mattered. Grace, he said. Her name was Grace. Tell me about her, Anna said. The sun was moving in the sky, and the East Field lay quiet before them, and Arthur Kendrick began, haltingly at first, and then with a slow, steady gathering, to tell her about Grace Kendrick, born Grace Tillman of San Marcos, Texas, who had been 23 years old when he married her and 26 when she died, who had been practical and funny, and had thought the ranch was the finest thing she had ever seen, who had planted the East Field herself the first year because she had grown up watching her grandmother grow things, and believed in the particular satisfaction of putting a seed in the ground and watching it come up, who had loved the mornings and hated the heat and read anything she could get her hands on and made terrible coffee and wonderful bread, who had fallen ill in November of 1878 with a fever that came on fast and hard, and who had gone out to the East Field that last morning, he thought, because she had always gone there when she needed to think clearly, and who he had found there at midday when she had not come in, collapsed near the far fence, already past the point where anything could help her. The fever having taken something essential in the night that none of them had understood yet. He spoke for nearly an hour, longer maybe. The sun moved and the shadows shifted, and Anna stood beside him at the fence and listened with her whole self, not managing the grief for him, not trying to shape it toward some more comfortable form, just receiving it. This was a man who had been carrying a secret sorrow for 4 years in complete isolation, who had been managing his dark past alone with a thoroughness that looked like strength from the outside, and was in fact a kind of slow, sealed-off suffocation, who had not spoken Grace's name aloud, she thought, in perhaps years, and who was now speaking it here to her in the afternoon light at the fence of the East Field. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Anna said when he had been silent for a while. She was, Arthur said, and then after a moment she would have liked you. Anna looked at him. He was looking at the East Field, but she looked at him, at the line of his jaw and the tension that was slowly, perceptibly releasing from his shoulders, and she felt the weight of what was happening with a clarity that was almost frightening. This was not a small thing. This was not an ordinary afternoon at a fence line. This was the moment a man who had locked himself inside his own grief for 4 years opened the door, just slightly, and looked out. She did not press. She did not take the thing he had just given her and immediately build it into something larger. She simply said, "Thank you for telling me," and meant it with her whole heart, and he nodded, and they stood at the fence a little longer, and then the evening was coming on and there were animals to feed and supper to make, and they walked back to the house side by side in the quiet that was no longer the same quiet as before. She made supper that night with extra care. Not sentimentally, not as some compensatory gesture, but because she was a woman who expressed things through the quality of her work when words were not right for a moment. And this was one of those moments. She made a proper roast with the early fall root vegetables from the garden and fresh bread and a dried apple pie from the stores. And when Arthur Kendrick came in from the evening chores and sat down at the table, he looked at what was in front of him. And then he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she had to look away before it undid her entirely. "Anna," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Miss Dugan for 4 months, and now she was Anna, and the single syllable of difference was enormous. "Sit down," she said, and she sat across from him, and they had supper, and he talked more than he had ever talked at a meal, still careful, still measured, but present in a way he had not been before. And she talked too, and Clem came in from the bunkhouse as he sometimes did for supper and found them talking and ate his meal with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been watching a locked house slowly show signs of light in its windows. October came in with a change in the air, the high blue sky of Texas fall and the first real cool nights, and the leaves of the cottonwoods going yellow. Anna had been on the ranch 5 months now, and the shape of her days had settled into something she would not have been willing to call contentment in May, but would use that word for now without significant qualification. She was also, with increasing difficulty, ignoring the fact that she was in love with Arthur Kendrick in a thorough and not particularly manageable way. It was not a girlish infatuation. It was not gratitude or loneliness dressed up as something else. She had given herself those exit ramps and walked carefully past each of them. It was the real thing, the kind that came from actually knowing a person, knowing the shape of their days and their silences and their humor when it came out, and the way they treated the animals and the land and the people who depended on them, and the specific quality of their integrity, which in Arthur Kendrick's case was something that ran all the way through him without interruption. He was not a man with hidden motives. He was not a man running a con. He was a man who had been broken by loss and who had chosen to survive it through work and discipline and the particular courage of simply continuing, and who was now, slowly, carefully, beginning to do something other than simply survive. She was watching him change, not dramatically, not in the way of romantic stories where a man is transformed suddenly by the arrival of the right woman. More genuinely than that, more slowly, more real. He laughed more. Not often. He was not a man given to easy laughter, but when something struck him as funny he let it out now instead of swallowing it back. And the sound of his actual laugh was something Anna thought about more than was strictly professional. He asked her opinions on things and listened to the answers. He started, in small ways, paying attention to the house as a place to live rather than a structure to shelter in. He brought her a book from the town's small lending library without her asking for it because Clem had mentioned she liked to read, and he had seen it and thought of her. And the simplicity and directness of the gesture kept Anna awake a certain night in early October longer than was wise. She was also aware, with the alertness of a woman who had been betrayed once and was watching carefully, that something was coming from him too. That the way he looked at her had changed from the appraising practical gaze of an employer to something that was considerably more personal and considerably more difficult to categorize. That he found reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings now that had not been there before. That when she was out in the kitchen garden, he would sometimes stop his work and stand for a moment watching her with an expression she had not named yet but was trying to. Clem noticed. Clem, who had been on the Kendrick ranch for 6 years and who had watched Arthur withdraw from the world after Grace's death with the helpless grief of someone who cared deeply and could do nothing, noticed with what Anna could only describe as barely contained delight. He was not obvious about it. But there were moments, a certain grin when he came in to find them talking, a certain careful arrangement of his own schedule that seemed designed to give them time alone, a certain warmth in the way he spoke to Anna that went beyond liking her competence, and seemed to include appreciation for what she was doing to the locked door man without either of them quite acknowledging what that was. One evening in mid-October, Arthur knocked on the door of her room. She was reading, the lamp turned up, and she opened the door and he was standing in the hallway with his hat already removed, which meant he had thought about this, had taken the hat off deliberately before knocking. "I wanted to say," he said, and then stopped and looked at the hat in his hands. "This is difficult for me to say directly." "That is all right," Anna said. "The time since you came," he said. "It has been the best time I have had in 4 years. And I know that might not mean very much to you, given where I started from, but I wanted you to know." Anna stood in the doorway and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully managing threaten to overtake her management entirely. She said, "It means a great deal to me." And then, because she was Anna Dugan and she was 26 years old and she had lost one man to cowardice, and she was not going to let the second good man she had ever met stand in a hallway talking around something he deserved to say clearly, she said, "Arthur, I think you should say what you actually mean to say." He looked up from his hat. He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression she was beginning to understand was his real face underneath everything else, the face that had been locked away with grace and was slowly, painfully, courageously coming back out into the air. He said, "I have feelings for you that go considerably beyond what is appropriate for our arrangement. I understand if that is not something you welcome. I wanted to be honest with you about it." Anna said, "I have the same feelings." The silence after that was different from every silence that had come before. It was full rather than empty. It had something in it that was warm and a little frightening and entirely alive. "I do not want to press you," he said, "after what happened to you in Galveston." "You are not pressing me," she said. "I am standing in this doorway telling you the same thing. Freely and entirely on purpose." Something moved across his face that she thought might have been the closest thing to joy she had ever seen on him. Not exuberant, not overwhelming, just a quiet, real deep warmth that started in his eyes and changed the whole of his expression. And Anna thought, there he is. That is who he actually is underneath everything that was done to him by 4 years of grief and isolation. There he is. He did not kiss her that night. He was too careful for that, too deliberate, too aware that they were standing at the beginning of something, and that beginnings deserve to be handled with respect. He said, "May I call on you properly, on Sunday?" with a formality that would have been almost comical if it had not been entirely sincere, and she said, "Yes," and he nodded once and put his hat on and went back down the hallway, and she closed her door and stood against it in the lamplight with her heart doing something completely irresponsible. The following weeks were a particular kind of beautiful. Arthur Kendrick courting Anna Dugan was a careful, deliberate, wonderful process that had very little to do with conventional courtship, and everything to do with two people who had both been hurt choosing to be honest with each other at every step. He took her driving on Sundays, out across the hill country roads, and they talked for hours about things that mattered. He told her about his childhood in Waco, his father who had been a farmer, and what he had learned from him about land and patience and the long view. She told him about her mother who had died when she was 12, and the way that loss had shaped her into someone who managed things, because managing things was the only way she had found to feel safe in a world that could take people away without notice. They found in the careful excavation of each other's pasts not just compatibility but something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to have been broken and to have kept going anyway. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday drive in late October, stopped at a bend in the river road where the cottonwoods were fully gold, and the water ran clear over the limestone and the light was perfect. And it was not a tentative, exploratory kiss. It was a kiss with intention and feeling, and the weight of everything they had said to each other. And Anna, who had been kissed before and had not until this moment fully understood what a kiss could carry, stood in the river road with Arthur Kendrick's hands holding hers and his mouth on hers, and the cottonwood leaves falling around them like small gold coins, and thought, "Oh, so this is what it actually is." He pulled back and looked at her. She looked at him. The gold light came through the leaves and made everything soft. "Anna," he said, and there was so much in her name when he said it. "Yes," she said, which was not a non sequitur but a continuation of a conversation they had been having for months. November came, and with it the anniversary of Grace's death. Anna had been thinking about it for weeks, about how to be what he needed during those days, how to be present without being intrusive, how to honor the grief without trying to resolve it or diminish it or rush it toward healing on her own timeline. This was a dark past that did not belong to her to manage. It belonged to him, and Grace belonged to it, and the only thing Anna could do was be near and be steady. On the morning of the anniversary, she found him at the east field fence before dawn, just standing there in the dark, facing east, watching the sky lighten over the cottonwoods. She brought 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him and handed him one, and he took it without a word, and they stood together in the cold morning air and watched the dawn come up over the east field, over the dark unplanted earth, and after a long time he said, very quietly, "I want to plant it again next spring." Anna looked at him. "I have been thinking about it since September," he said. "Since the day you asked me, since I said it out loud for the first time." He paused. "Grace loved that field. She would not want it to stay empty. She would think I was being—" He stopped, and there was the brief, real, slightly surprised sound of almost laughter in his voice. "She would think I was being stubborn." "Was she right about things generally?" Anna asked. "Almost always," he said. "And there was grief in that. But there was also love, clean and undefended, the kind that survives loss and becomes something you carry as weight and gift together." Anna put her hand through his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and they stood at the fence in the November dawn, and the east field breathed quietly before them, waiting, patient as ground always is, ready to receive whatever came next. That afternoon he rode into Harlan's Creek and came back with a small package. He set it on the kitchen table when she was making supper, and she looked at it and then at him, and he said, "Open it," with the carefully managed expression of a man trying not to show how much something mattered. Inside the package was a ring. Not a new ring. An older one, simple gold with a small garnet set in it, nothing extravagant. He said, "It was my grandmother's. I have been carrying it in my saddlebag for 3 weeks, not knowing what to do with it. I know this may be. I know we have not been doing this very long. But I know what I want, and I am not a man who is good at not saying what I mean when I know it clearly." Anna looked at the ring, and then at Arthur Kendrick standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and 3 weeks of uncertainty on his face. And she thought about Galveston and Thomas Greer, and the cold, efficient letter and $37, and the stage from San Antonio and the East Field in Grace's name and the November dawn, and the book from the lending library and Sunday drives on river roads and gold cottonwood leaves. And she said, "Arthur Kendrick, if you are asking me to marry you." "The answer is yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit almost perfectly. He held her hand in both of his and looked at her, and the locked-door face was fully open. No reserve, no management, just the man himself, and it was the finest thing she had ever seen. Clem, who had been listening from the porch with absolutely no shame whatsoever, made a noise that could only be described as satisfaction made audible, and they both heard it, and Anna covered her mouth with her free hand, and Arthur Kendrick laughed. A full, real laugh, not the almost laughter she had been collecting, but the actual thing, warm and open and wonderful, and she thought, there is the answer. That is what happiness sounds like on him. They were married in January of 1883 in the Harlan's Creek Church, which was a small white building with a good stove, and a congregation that had been speculating about the Kendrick Ranch situation since May with considerable interest. Mabel Dodd sat in the front row with an expression of complete vindication. The preacher, a straightforward man named Reverend Cates, performed the ceremony with efficiency and warmth, and when Arthur Kendrick said, "I will," his voice was clear and sure and direct, and Anna felt it in her bones, and when she said it back, she meant every word with the full force of who she was. The celebration afterward was in the church hall, small and warm, with whiskey for the men and lemonade for the women and a fiddle player named Erasmus Pike, who played with tremendous enthusiasm if variable pitch. And Clem danced with Mabel Dodd for 3 consecutive songs and seemed quite pleased about it. And Anna stood in the center of it all in the best dress she owned, green wool that brought out the brown of her hair, and looked at her husband across the room. And Arthur Kendrick looked back at her across the room, and the private thing between them in that public moment was as clear as a bell and just as loud in its silence. On the drive back to the ranch that evening, the January sky enormous and black and blazing with stars, Anna sat close beside him on the wagon seat, and his arm was around her shoulders, and the horses moved steadily through the cold, clear air, and she understood, as happy as she had ever been. Not the complicated, managed, defended approximation of happiness she had been performing for herself in Galveston. The actual thing. The kind that required courage to receive. "I have been thinking about the spring," Arthur said. "The East Field," she said. "Yes, I thought if you were willing you might help me decide what to plant. Since you have made that kitchen garden into something considerable." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder. "I would like that very much," she said. Winter on the Kendrick ranch was cold and clear and busy in its particular winter ways, the constant maintenance that kept a cattle operation running through the slow season, the mending and planning, and the long evenings by the fire that Anna found she loved more than she had ever loved anything about domestic life before. They were evenings of conversation and reading and chess, which Arthur played with considerable skill, and which Anna matched him at to his genuine and delighted surprise, and the particular intimacy of 2 people learning a shared life in all its ordinary particulars, learning each other's small habits and preferences, and the things that mattered and the things that didn't, learning how to fight, which they did twice that winter, both times about minor things that were actually about larger things underneath. Both times resolved with the directness that was native to both of them, an honesty that sometimes required courage, but that never required pretending. In February, she wrote to her father in Galveston. She wrote carefully and honestly. She told him about the ranch and about Arthur and about what she had found here, and she did not editorialize about Thomas Greer, except to say that she was glad things had fallen out as they did because the life she had arrived at was the best she could imagine. Her father wrote back 3 weeks later, the letter arriving on a cold March morning, and she read it at the kitchen table and cried, because he said he was glad and that he wished her mother could have seen her, and that he hoped Arthur Kendrick understood what he had. She showed Arthur the letter, and he read it and handed it back and said, "Your father is right," with such simple certainty that she had to look out the kitchen window for a moment before she could look back at him. March brought the beginning of preparations for spring planting. Arthur and Clem worked through the practical planning of the season, which fields would carry what, how to manage the water from the creek, the logistics of a cattle operation that also ran a working garden and grain crop. And one morning in late March, Arthur brought the plow to the east field fence. He stood at the gate for a long time before he opened it. Anna was watching from the yard. She did not approach. She simply stood where she was and let this be his moment, his private reckoning with a 4-year-old grief and the choice to move through it rather than around it forever. He opened the gate. He led the plow through. He walked to the center of the east field and stopped and stood there for several minutes, alone in the middle of that ground that had held the worst day of his life. And Anna could see from where she stood that he was speaking, just slightly, his lips moving, and she understood that he was saying something to Grace, something private and necessary, a goodbye or a thank you or a permission, and she looked away to give him that privacy and felt her heart ache with a clean, uncomplicated ache for everything he had carried. Then she heard the plow begin to move. The sound of iron through Texas earth, that clean tearing sound, And she looked back, and Arthur Kendrick was plowing the east field for the first time in 4 years, moving in long straight lines from one fence to the other. And in the March morning light, the turned earth was dark and rich and real. And Anna stood in the yard and watched, and felt the importance of the moment settle into her like something permanent. She was also, with a quiet and private certainty she had not yet shared with him, aware that there was going to be a child. She was not entirely certain, but she was certain enough. And she thought about the east field being planted again in the same spring, that a new life was beginning in this house, and the symmetry of it was something she held gently, like a thing you carry carefully because it is worth protecting. She told Arthur 2 weeks later. On the porch in the late afternoon, the east field now fully turned and ready and waiting for seed, the garden coming in green in its ordered beds, the cottonwoods leafing out in their first pale green. She said, "I think there is going to be a child." He turned to look at her with an expression that went through several things very quickly, things she watched move across him like weather, surprise, and something that might have been fear, the fear of a man who had loved and lost and knew how much love cost. And underneath that, rising through it, something she had not seen on him before, a particular kind of wonder that belonged specifically to this news, this moment, this life they were building. He said, "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she said, "but fairly." He reached over and took her hand and held it. He was looking at the east field. She looked at it too. "I want this," he said. "I want to tell you clearly that I want this. All of it." "I know," she said. And she did. Summer came in with its full Texas force, the heat building from May onward into the heavy, pressing weight of July and August, and Anna was firmly, unmistakably, entirely with child, and the ranch operated around this fact with the pragmatic tenderness of people who cared about each other. Arthur managed the physical work with a quiet attentiveness to her that was never overprotective but always present. Clem, who had 3 grown children of his own back in East Texas, offered practical wisdom at regular intervals with the tact of long experience. Mabel Dodd rode out twice a month from her place 4 miles south and sat in the kitchen with Anna and talked about the things women talked about when they were preparing for this particular event, and their friendship, which had begun with Mabel's cryptic comment about the east field, deepened into something Anna valued greatly. The east field was planted with winter wheat. Arthur had decided on winter wheat after considerable thought, and it had come up beautifully through April and May, the green heads moving in the wind, covering the ground that had been bare so long, and Anna watched it from the kitchen window in the mornings and thought about planted things, and how they required both the right ground and the right time and could not be forced, but could be cultivated carefully. Arthur would sometimes stand at the east field fence in the evenings, looking in rather than away, and Anna thought that the relationship he was building with that piece of ground was something like what she had watched him build with her, careful and deliberate and honest, a reclamation rather than a replacement, a way of carrying what had been lost while also making room for what was new. In September of 1883, exactly 1 year after Anna had asked her question at the fence, and Arthur had given her the answer he had never said aloud, their son was born. A healthy boy, born on a Tuesday morning with a voice that announced itself without hesitation, and a grip that immediately demonstrated a personality. Arthur held him in the kitchen while the doctor, old Dr. Paris from town, finished his work and Mabel hovered competently, and Anna watched Arthur Kendrick hold their son, and the expression on his face was the one she had been cataloging and naming for a year now, fully open, fully present, the locked door not just open but off its hinges entirely and no plans to rehang it. "What will you call him?" Mabel asked. Arthur looked at Anna. Anna looked at Arthur. "William," Anna said, "for your father." Arthur's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, "William," and nodded and looked back down at the boy. And William Kendrick made an opinion known about something or other, and Arthur laughed, that full real laugh that Anna had first heard on the evening of their engagement, and she lay back against the pillow and thought, yes, this is right. This is what it was all moving toward. The ranch ran well through that fall and winter, better than it had run in years, and people in Harlan's Creek noticed. The Kendrick operation had always been respected, but somewhat grim in its efficiency, running on the single-minded competence of a man who had removed everything from his life that was not strictly necessary. Now there was life in it. The house had curtains Anna had sewn from fabric brought in from San Antonio. There was a kitchen garden that was the finest in the county by general consensus. There was a baby in the house and a woman's voice, and a man who came to town with a different quality about him, lighter, more present, someone who could be caught smiling at some private thought. Clem observed all of this with the satisfaction of a man watching something go right after watching it go wrong for a long time. He had been on the Kendrick ranch through the worst of it, through the winter of Grace's death, and the following year when Arthur had worked himself like a machine, and spoken to no one and eaten like a man fueling an engine rather than feeding himself, and through the 4 years of the empty field and the locked door, and the slow accumulation of a silence that had worried Clem in ways he had not known how to address. He had not said a word when the advertisement for a domestic hand went out in May of 1882. He had been quietly hopeful and carefully not obvious about it. On a December evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while Anna nursed William in the rocking chair and Arthur read the newspaper, Clem said, without preamble, "This is a good house now." And then he seemed slightly surprised that he had said it out loud and occupied himself with his coffee. Arthur lowered the newspaper. He looked at Anna. She looked at him over William's head. The lamp made everything warm and the fire was going and the December wind pushed at the windows and the house held. "Yes," Arthur said simply and completely, "it is." The year 1884 opened with a cold, clear January, and a Harlan's Creek that was growing in the particular way that small Texas towns grew in the 1880s. The rail line coming closer every year. New settlers coming through and some of them staying. New businesses opening. A second general store and a proper doctor's office. And a schoolhouse being organized with considerable community energy. Anna had been involved in the schoolhouse committee from its earliest planning stages, because she had opinions about education and the particular importance of books, and because she had come to understand about herself, not actually made for a quiet life. She was made for engagement and work and the particular pleasure of getting things done, and the ranch gave her that, and the community gave her more of it, and the combination suited her exactly. Arthur watched her in town meetings and social gatherings with an expression that was at least partially bemused and entirely fond. She had, in the 2 years since her arrival in Harlan's Creek, become someone the town recognized as a person whose opinion was worth having, which was not automatically true of women in 1882 Texas, and which Anna had achieved not through demanding it, but through the force of being consistently right about practical matters, and having the patience to wait for people to notice. Arthur, who was quiet in company and always had been, found himself talking more in her wake, drawn into conversations by her natural social energy in a way that was actually useful for a man who owned a ranch, and needed to maintain relationships with neighbors and businessmen, and the various people whose goodwill was practically valuable. They were, in the way of the best partnerships, better together than either was separately. In the spring of 1884, the East Field was planted again. Arthur had decided on corn this year, and the planting was a whole day's work that he did himself, early, starting before dawn while the morning was still cool. Anna brought out coffee mid-morning and they sat at the fence together with their cups and looked at the planted rows, and Arthur put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close, and she leaned into him, and William was back at the house with Clem, who was entirely willing to manage a 9-month-old for an hour, and the East Field stretched before them, planted, alive with potential. "Do you know what I thought that day you asked me?" Arthur said. "Why I had never planted it. What did you think?" "I thought she is going to think I am broken beyond repair." He paused. "I thought it was the kind of thing that would send a sensible woman directly back to the stage to Galveston." Anna considered this. Did it occur to you that a woman who left Galveston with $37 and a broken engagement and came to a stranger's ranch in the middle of Texas might not be primarily characterized by a preference for easy situations? He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. It occurred to me afterward, he said, as it should have. He kissed the top of her head, and she felt the full, comfortable, real weight of his regard, the kind of love that was past the early bright terror of new feeling and had settled into something deeper and more durable, the kind built from shared mornings and hard conversations and the practical intimacy of two people living a life together and choosing it freshly every day. "I am glad you asked," he said. "I am glad you answered." The corn came up strong through May and June, tall and green and alive in the field that had been empty so long. And people in the area noticed, and Clem noticed, and Mabel Dodd noticed, and nobody said anything about it directly because there are certain things that are better honored by observation than by comment. But everyone understood that the east field being planted again meant something on the Kendrick ranch that was larger than the agricultural fact of it. In the fall of 1884, Arthur rode into Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday and came back with two things. One was a letter from Anna's father saying that his health had improved sufficiently for travel and asking whether a visit in the spring might be manageable. The other was a book, a new novel just arrived at the general store from the east, which he had bought on impulse because he knew she would want it before anyone else in the county could get to it first. He gave her the book first and then the letter, and she read the letter and looked up at him. "You do not mind," she said. "Your father is welcome in this house for as long as he wants to stay," Arthur said, with the directness that was entirely characteristic of him when he had already decided something. "He is your family. This is your home. Those facts do not require negotiation." Anna stood in the kitchen holding the letter and felt the word, home, settle into her with the completeness of something that had been tested and proven. This was her home. Not in the sense of a place she had been accepted into or permitted to occupy, but in the full sense, the irreversible sense, the sense of a place that belonged to her because she belonged to it. Her father came in April of 1885. James Dugan was 61 years old, and the business failure had aged him, but the months of improvement had put something back in his face. And when he stepped off the stage at Harlan's Creek and saw Anna there waiting with William on her hip, the old man's composure held for about 3 seconds before it did not hold at all, and Anna handed William to Arthur, who was standing beside her, and went and held her father on the main street of Harlan's Creek without caring at all who saw. James Dugan stayed for 6 weeks. He and Arthur got along in the way of two men who were both reserved and practical, and who therefore spoke to each other with the direct efficiency of people who did not need to fill silences with noise. James walked the ranch with Arthur and asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers, and helped with small things without making a production of it, and played with William with a grandfather's uncomplicated delight, and sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the land and seemed to find in it some of what his daughter had found, which was a quality of realness and clarity that life in a coastal city could not quite provide. One evening near the end of his stay, James Dugan found Arthur at the east field fence at dusk and stood beside him, and the two men looked at the growing crop in the last light, and James said, "She told me about the field, what it meant." Arthur said nothing, but he did not move away. "She is a good woman," James said. "She has been the best thing in my life since her mother died. I am glad she found someone worth trusting." Arthur said, "I am grateful for her every day." James looked at him and then looked back at the field. "Good," he said, and that was that. When James Dugan left on the stage back to San Antonio in May, he was crying, which he had not done in Anna's presence since her childhood, and Anna was crying too, and William contributed his own vocal opinion on the departure, and Arthur stood with his hand on Anna's back and let the moment be what it was. That evening after supper he sat close beside her on the porch, and she leaned against him, and the spring evening was warm and fragrant with the kitchen garden and the new grass and the distant sound of the creek. "I want him to come back," she said, every year if he can. Of course, Arthur said. Maybe eventually for good, she said, if his health permits, if he wanted. Arthur considered this. There is the room at the back of the house, he said. It has been unused since you moved into the main bedroom. If he wanted to come permanently, we would make it work. Anna turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the yard, practical and sure, and she thought about the man who had arrived in his life in May of 1882 with 2 carpet bags and a question about an empty field, and the man sitting beside her now, and the distance between them was a distance that love had traveled, carefully and honestly and without guarantees, and it had arrived somewhere worth being. "I love you," she said. She had said it many times before this. It did not lose weight with repetition, it gained it. "I love you," he said, certain complete the way he said everything when he meant it fully. "I have since October, I think, maybe September." "September," she agreed, "at the fence." Yes. In the summer of 1885, Anna was expecting again. She told Arthur on a morning in June, same porch, same quality of early light, and his response this time was faster and more direct. He took her hands and smiled, a full, open smile that she had been collecting for 3 years now and never stopped noticing, and said, "Good," and she laughed and said, "Good." And he said, "Good," again with the same simple absolute certainty, and she loved him so much in that moment that it was almost more than she knew what to do with. Their second child was a girl, born in February of 1886, strong and loud and red-faced and entirely herself from the first moment. They named her Clara, for Anna's friend in Houston, and for the sound of it, clear and uncomplicated, the name of a person who would speak plainly and mean what she said. Clara Kendrick came into the world in the same house, where 4 years ago there had been only one man eating alone in the kitchen, and an empty field outside, and a grief so large it had taken the shape of the whole landscape. The East Field was now a permanent part of the Kendrick operation. Arthur rotated crops with attention and care, winter wheat and corn and a second year of wheat again, and the field performed well, the soil rich from its years of rest, and Arthur managed it with the particular care of a man who understood that some things were worth tending with extra attention because of what they had cost to return to. He went to the East Field fence on certain November mornings alone, always early, before the day's work began. Anna knew. She did not follow him on those mornings. That was Grace's time and Grace's field, and Grace would always have those mornings, and Anna held no competing claim to them and wanted none. What Arthur gave her was given freely and fully, and with the wholeness of a man who had found the way to carry his past without being imprisoned by it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Clem turned 57 in 1887 and began to talk, with some frequency, about eventually retiring to be near his children in East Texas. He talked about it for 3 years before it became a plan and another 2 before it became a date. And in 1889 he left the Kendrick Ranch with a handshake from Arthur that became, after a moment's hesitation, an embrace, and with Anna's cooking packed for the journey, and William, who was 6 years old, solemnly presenting Clem with a drawing he had made of the barn, and Clara, who was 3, weeping with cheerful abandon because she was Clara, and did everything at full volume. Clem leaving was a genuine loss that required adjustment. Arthur hired 2 younger hands, brothers named Dawson and Pete Farrell, from a family near town who were good workers and easy in their company. And the ranch operated without the irreplaceable Clem as well as it could, which was well enough. And they wrote to Clem every few months, and he wrote back in the large, careful script of a man who had not had much schooling but took the effort seriously. The schoolhouse in Harlan's Creek opened its doors in 1884 and was running properly by 1886, with a teacher named Miss Hartwell who was from Ohio and had opinions about education that closely matched Anna's own. And they became good friends, and Anna was on the school board and put considerable energy into ensuring the school had books, and that those books were good ones. William started school in 1888 and took to it with the focused seriousness that was his father's gift and a natural curiosity that was his own. And Clara started 2 years later and approached school with Clara's characteristic combination of enthusiasm and disorder that somehow produced excellent results. Anna's father James came back to the ranch in 1887, this time for good. His health had declined enough that living alone in Galveston was no longer practical, and Arthur had offered the back room again, without drama, and James had accepted without extended ceremony, and he settled into the ranch with the adaptability of a man who had outlasted his expectations of himself and was willing to be surprised by what remained. He was useful in small ways, managing the chickens and the kitchen garden when Anna was occupied, telling William and Clara stories about their mother's childhood with a specificity that moved Anna deeply every time she heard him doing it. He died in 1891, peacefully, in his own room in Arthur's house that had become his house that had become a family's house, and they buried him in the Harlan's Creek churchyard next to a marker they put up for their own record. And Anna stood at the grave in the October morning and held Arthur's hand and felt the particular ache of loving someone you could not keep and the particular consolation of being surrounded by people you could. The 1890s moved through the Kendrick Ranch with the accumulating richness of years that have been well built. William was 12 in 1895 and already working the ranch with his father with the purposeful competence of a boy who had grown up watching how things were done and why they mattered. Clara was 9 and reading everything she could find and fighting regularly with William about anything available and deeply, unambiguously, her own person, which delighted Arthur to a degree he expressed through a dry humor that was one of Anna's favorite things about him. They had a third child, a boy named James for Anna's father, born in 1892, who was the quietest of the three and showed every sign of having Arthur's particular quality of attentive stillness, watching the world carefully and saying what he thought when he had thought it through. The east field was planted every year. It was the best producing field on the ranch by 1890, the long rest having done the soil considerable good. Arthur managed it with the attention he gave to everything he valued, and Anna sometimes walked its perimeter in the evenings when the crop was up and the light was right, just to feel what it felt like. This ground that had held the deepest secret and the deepest grief, and that had become, through planting and tending and the slow work of return, something alive and productive and unashamed. In 1895, a woman came through Harlan's Creek who had known Grace Tillman before she became Grace Kendrick, a woman named Josephine Marsh who had grown up in San Marcos and was passing through on the way to her sister's place further west. She stopped at the Kendrick Ranch with a letter of introduction from someone in town who had known about the connection, and she sat in Anna's kitchen and drank Anna's coffee and talked about Grace with the warmth of genuine remembered friendship. And Anna listened and asked questions, and Josephine looked at her with a slight wariness, checking for what lay underneath the questions, and seemed to find nothing there but honest interest. She said to Anna, on her way out to the wagon, she was a lovely woman. She would be glad, I think, for all of this. Anna said, I believe so too, and meant it. Arthur was in the yard when Josephine drove away, and he looked at Anna on the porch, and she looked at him, and she gave him a small nod, and something in his face settled into gratitude. He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her and held her face in his work-rough hands and looked at her for a long moment with everything they were to each other entirely visible in his expression, not edited, not managed, just completely there. You are extraordinary, he said. You know that. I am practical, she said, which is nearly the same thing. He kissed her forehead and she put her hands over his, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built together, in the full, ordinary, extraordinary life they had made, and the east field was green in the afternoon light behind them, and the cottonwoods moved in the September wind, and the children were somewhere on the ranch being themselves, and everything was whole. It was not a life without difficulty. The drought of 1886 had been hard, and the years when cattle prices dropped were lean, and the ranch required constant work, and the work was not always comfortable, and there were days when everything was difficult, and the distances between people that naturally occurred in daily life had to be deliberately crossed. They had hard conversations when hard conversations were required. They disagreed about things and said so and worked it out. They had mornings that were not good mornings and made space for that without making it permanent. They were two real people living a real life in real Texas in the 1880s and 1890s, and real lives have weather. But they had built the thing correctly. Built it on what was actually there between them rather than on what they had wanted or needed to be there. Built it on honesty about dark pasts and hidden griefs and the specific vulnerabilities of people who had been hurt before and were choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to be vulnerable again. Built it on the shared understanding that love was not a state you arrived at and then inhabited without maintenance, but a practice, a daily choosing, a thing you tended the way you tended a field, with attention and patience and the faith that what you planted would come up. In November of 1898, exactly 20 years after Grace Kendrick's death, Arthur went to the east field fence at dawn as he always did on that morning. Anna woke early and dressed quietly and went to the kitchen and put the coffee on, and when it was ready, she carried 2 cups out to the porch and watched him at the fence in the gray early light, and she felt the full weight of 20 years, of all the things that had grown and changed and been built in this place, and she also felt the weight of the specific grief that November always carried, and she held both of those things with the steady hands she had always had for holding difficult things. Arthur came back from the fence and took the cup she handed him and sat down beside her on the porch steps, and they watched the sun come up over the east field, the wheat stubble golden in the first light, and the cottonwoods bare and silver in the November morning, and the sky going from gray to rose to pale blue above them. 20 years, he said. Yes. I have thought about what you asked me, he said. That day at the fence, all those years ago, what you asked and what I said. I think about it too, Anna said. I was so afraid to say it. I had built so much of my life around not saying it that I had almost convinced myself not saying it was the same as it not being true. He paused, and his voice had in it the particular steadiness of a man who has looked at something painful for a long time and learned to look at it cleanly. And then you asked, and it came out, and the world did not end. And you stayed. You just stood there and you stayed. There was nowhere else I wanted to be, Anna said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him as she had been leaning into him for 16 years, with the ease of long habit and the warmth of continuing choice. And William was in the house somewhere, 14 years old, and already the height of his father and quieter than either of them with the contained interior life that was entirely his own. And Clara was 12 and already running the kitchen garden with an efficiency that made Anna proud and the chickens somewhat nervous. And James was 6 and sleeping soundly, because James slept through everything. And the east field lay before them in the November dawn, planted and alive, 20 years of growth and return, 20 years of choosing to put things living into the ground that had held the deepest loss, 20 years of the proof that grief did not have to be a permanent stopping place, that the things that broke you could be the places where the most important things grew back. Thank you, Arthur said, for asking, for everything after. Anna looked at the field and felt the full, completed thing her life had become, not a perfect thing, not an uncomplicated thing, but a full one, whole and honest and real, built on the single brave moment when a question was asked and a door was opened and 2 people who had both been left with nothing chose each other carefully, honestly, and for good. 16 years, she said, and I would ask again. He turned his head and looked at her. The morning light was full now and warm on his face, 50 years old and everything his life had done to him visible in it, all of it, and under all of it the open, undefended expression that had been there since October of 1882 and never really left, the real face, the man himself. So would I, he said. Answer again, every time. The sun cleared the ridge of cottonwoods and came full and flat and gold across the east field, and the wheat stubble caught the light and the whole field shone. And Arthur Kendrick and Anna Dugan Kendrick sat on the porch steps of their house in the hill country of Texas and held their coffee cups and watched the light move across the planted ground. And the morning expanded around them into the ordinary beautiful substance of a shared life, and everything that had ever been broken here was mended. And everything that had ever been silent was spoken, and the field that had been empty for 4 years was empty no longer, and had not been for a long time, and would not be again. Inside the house, James woke up and announced this with his full voice, and Clara could be heard telling him to be quiet in terms that suggested the complexity of their sibling dynamic, and William's measured footsteps crossed the floor toward the kitchen, already practical at 14, already making himself useful, and Arthur Kendrick smiled at the sounds of his house being alive, at the ordinary noisy morning reality of a family in a place that had known only silence for too long. And the smile was the real one, the full one, the one that had been locked away and had come back and had been getting better ever since. Anna leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his hand over hers. The east field caught the morning sun and held it, and the day began.